Judith is a game about control. It's also an adaptation of an old fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was this woman, and she married a dude. He had a castle, and his name was John. It wasn't John, it was Bluebeard. Bluebeard was creepy! He gave his wife permission to explore his whole castle except for one room. Obviously, she wasn't going to follow the rules because us Wimbledons have a long and storied history of opening up things that are meant to always be locked. She finds out that Bluebeard murders all of his wives, and then he decides he's going to kill her too. But it's all okay because the brothers came.
The poor wife, who was almost as dead as her husband, was not able at first to rise and embrace her brothers, and as Bluebeard had no heirs, she found herself the owner of his great riches. Some of the money she laid out in buying captain's commissions for her two brothers, and the rest she gave to a worthy gentleman whom she married shortly after.
There was no psychological trauma. Stop asking questions. This narrative, in the context of the game, is framed by that of Jeff and Emily, who are two adulterous lovers that, at the beginning of the game, are meeting up at the Death Castle for an extramarital tryst. They get lost immediately. And the player switches between playing as Jeff while he searches for Emily, and Judith, back when she was wandering around her homicidal husband's castle. After the scene where Judith's husband puts her into storage, the game cuts back to Emily and Jeff to show them stationed in the very same spots that the player had just seen Judith and her husband in not a moment before. What's implied here is that Jeff and Emily were caught up in an overly enthusiastic role-playing session. The only character models that we see are Emily and Bluebeard's, people from different narratives, which is achronological, and that leaves room for us to speculate about the roles that Jeff and Judith play in their respective narrative loci, or in their relationships. I don't know why I didn't just say that. What I'm trying to say is that because we don't know what everybody in the story looks like, we can think about Judith and her husband as being alter egos through which Jeff and Emily can explore their fantasies, specifically their fantasies about control. Now, there are multiple ways that this game elucidates on the theme of control, or a lack thereof. Bluebeard tries to exercise his need for control on the bodies of his wives, so the moment that they express any sort of, agency, he murders them. On the level of the frame story, there's a loss of control manifesting in the very confused and disorienting arc that Jeff and Emily go through. The last way, which is one that you might not be able to see as someone who's just watching this game, is the way that control is periodically wrested away from the player to force them to watch as their avatar acts of its own accord. You can kind of tell when this is happening because the camera movements will become suddenly very smooth. On these three planes, Jeff/Emily, Judith/husband, and player/game, Judith gestures towards the unsettling ramifications behind a loss of control. I mean, okay, Bluebeard's goal in giving his wife the key to his dungeon wasn't to conceal a secret. It was to test his wife to see if she would obey him. A loss of control in Jeff and Emily's context is frightening. They've effectively dissociated through over-enthusiastic live-action role-playing to their own subsequent disempowerment. And the degrees to which either has been disempowered or empowered is kind of unclear. The player is drawn into a similar dynamic with the game itself as they periodically relinquish and regain total control over the player characters. So keep all of that in mind, but set it aside for now. I'm gonna come back to it later. At this point, some of Judith's conceits should sound familiar to you. In Bioshock, that's right, we're talking about Bioshock. No, I don't have anything new to say. Oh yes, I need to do some self-reflecting. The player is rendered complicit in what are ultimately stories about a loss of control or a misapprehension of the ethics of one's actions. The player and Jack are left doubting the extent of their own free will and their own self-control after Jack is revealed to be completely at the mercy of whoever utters the phrase that he's been preconditioned to respond to. Hey, would you kindly send me chocolate? So, the game raises a few questions about the player's ability to make choices by directly correlating Jack's subjection to the player's engagement with the game. The whole entire world was completely floored by this revelation because, oh my god, we were also would you kindlying. Bioshock toys with the presupposition that the player has any free will or agency to speak of, and it also erases the distinction between the player and the player character. I actually also found an article that talked about how, at the end of the day, the player/Jack aren't really any different from the splicers, because even if you save the little sisters, you're still hunting for Adam. You still need Adam as much as the splicers do to be/feel powerful. So what is there to distinguish us? All that just means that you're doing what you do because there's some sort of reward. Not unlike the splicers, you must have some sort of uncontrollable urge to do this reward pleasure seeking that you're doing, right? That's right. That's also to say nothing of the games that integrate the role of the author into that paradigm. Games like Superhot and Pony Island configure the player and the developer's relationship as one of deep-seated enmity. The player characters / player's mastery or base completion over the game isn't viewed as a good thing here. Like, the player's absolute lack of agency in Superhot is definitely not framed as a good thing. There's a point where Superhot calls you a dog, called me personally a dog, I'll never forgive it, and says walk forward, sit, stand, whatever. And you have to do those things to proceed with the game. So if you follow those orders, you're proving the game right. You're proving that you don't actually have any self-control. And if you finish the game, do you? Wouldn't the ultimate act of mastery over the game, over Superhot specifically, be to not complete it? But also, because the narrative never could finish if the player didn't complete it, it would be left in a state of suspension. So it wouldn't even be a victory for the player because things would just be on pause until somebody picked up that save file and completed it, right? I don't know how much this has been talked about. I haven't done any research on like YouTube criticism of Superhot, but the player character is by themselves a really interesting commentary on control. There's this one part where you start pressing R1. I don't know if you use PS4 or not. Is there any other console? I'm just kidding. Brand loyalty is dumb. Don't do it. There's this one part where you press R1 over and over again to type, and the text that comes up on screen is, I'm not even typing this. I don't understand what's going on. In a sense, this is true for the player. Like, just pressing R1 doesn't produce language, so this is maybe an indication that the player has lost total control. At the same time, it could be a signal to us that the player has taken total control over the player character. Like, they're trying to say that they're not typing it as if they have no control over their body. So from the moment you turn the game on, the player character becomes an observer in their own body. But to what end? Like, is the player the control freak? Is the developer the control mastermind? Is this some sort of prank? Is it the developer characters that are the actual masterminds? Or is this all just some sort of convoluted thought experiment that never leads to any sort of conclusions and that I've been sweating over for a month for no reason? These games aren't really about Judith or Jack or whoever the fuck is in Superhot. The player character is effectively the deuteragonist, because these games are about the experience of play and players' false senses of security within the narratives and mechanical contexts of the games that they play. I like to think of the player character the way that I do the unreliable narrator in literature. We get to talk about books. But stay! I promise you'll find this very interesting. In literary studies, we use the phrase unreliable narrator to refer to a narrator whose perspective has been compromised. They could be a liar, they could be unstable, they may not be able to evaluate their own perspective or subjectivity, so they could be insane. That's a super common trope in horror. If you've ever read a story by Edgar Allan Poe, you've read a story with an unreliable narrator. There's one that's like Fitzwatson. It's like a guy who like sees himself in this other dude and he ends up murdering him. Anyway. The narrator is usually assumed to be the objective avenue through which readers can access the world of the story and the story more generally. So if their perspective isn't actually objective, if it turns out that the person who's supposed to be objective is actually a subject, then the reader is forced to contemplate the way that they have digested the story. It's a device or a trope or whatever the fuck you want to call it. It's a thing that helps call attention to the way that we make meaning of the text. Films do this sometimes too. There's a whole movie called Peeping Tom that's just about scopophilia, which I guess you could say is just a fancy word for describing a fetishistic love of looking at shit, especially women who are shit. The main character attaches a literal blade to his camera and then records footage of women while he stabs them with his camera knife. So, like, he's killing women with his gaze. Since the camera and the viewer adopt what's functionally the same perspective, the people who watch the film are implicated in the violence of the character on screen. It's a film about looking through film. Every medium has works that contemplate the nature of playing or viewing or reading or what have you. What's unique about video games is that the player's role in the story is participatory to a greater extent than analogous mediums. This is the conclusion corner. We're gonna come to some conclusions right here and right now. When we talk about the player character's perspective, right, and we talk about the way that the game world is unfurled in front of their eyes, we are, by extension, calling into question the player's biases and morals and perspective. A story can be unsettling when you realize that the narrator is unreliable, because it means that you can be taken in. You can be deceived, and you can believe the deception. A horror film might shock you by showing you the perspective of the murderer while he kills Wimblewombles. You have been rendered a bystander. Oh, this hat. You have been rendered a bystander to murder, which means that technically any movie you've watched with any sort of atrocity has made you complicit in the things that you're seeing on screen. You are a passive piece of shit, but games can fuck with you by showing you that you're not just a passive viewer to their drama. You are an actor within that drama. You are as susceptible to deceit and lies as the reader of an unreliable narrator. But more than that, what has gone down in the game couldn't have happened without you. I think I just have to abandon the hat. These games are combining the creepiness of the unreliable narrator with the fucking mindfuckery of cinema as it adopts the perspective of maniacs. In effect, these games are interrogating the fundamental characteristics of play, because this is what play is. You control an avatar. But then why do we do it? And is there even a way to conduct play or to do games without this dynamic coming into effect? Did I say that kind of weird? I don't want to reshoot this. Also, it's been like 2 weeks since I shot the last live action portion. I literally put my makeup on in the exact same way. I haven't worn this shirt since that day, just to fool you into thinking that this was the same thing. I just broke the illusion. And the only reason that I'm not at my desk right now is because there's a huge mess behind my chair. It's all my laundry that I haven't folded. I have a job. Ultimately, the questions that I've posed to you in this video don't have definitive answers. They're the kinds of things that people mull over for a very long time and kind of pretend to have come to conclusions about, but it's just super fun to waffle about it, so why would we ever end the discussion? On the one hand, I think that these games are framing play in video games as a macabre, dark, hyper-controlling kind of interaction. Across all the games that I showed you today, control is really destructive, and usually being able to control these player characters induces some sort of discomfort or friction in the player. So if that's the case, I have to then decide whether or not these games are saying that control leads to some sort of moral deficiency in the player, or that it's like a myopic kind of way to interact and engage with the world of the game because it's like it prioritizes the reward and doesn't necessarily highlight the reverberating effects of the player's actions. When Judith starts to act outside of the player's input, it feels abrupt and a bit annoying and kind of scary. Hey, Judith, don't touch that guy. And because it can be frustrating, I think that the player is supposed to be conflated to Judith's husband there, which would in turn mean that our need to exercise our will over this figure, Judith, might be bad. Or it's possible that we're more like Judith. Like, it could be that the game taking control away from us is an imposition on our human rights. So are the developers like Bluebeard? Is the author a maniac? Are all games about control? Can I go another day without showering? I forgot to record a segment on Pony Island, so Pony Island is a game about a game. What you see on the computer screen within the screen is a game developed by Satan, and the joke is that it's fucking so broken and garbage that it's unplayable. A substantial portion of the game is dedicated to messing with the UI and hacking puzzles and conversations where you antagonize the developer Satan. It eventually asks why you can't just play the game, and that's a provocative question. Why do we mod and hack and mess with games? I'd say that in Pony Island, we're Judithing. We're relishing in our own idiosyncratic views of freedom, and the developer character Satan guy is Bluebearding. He's holding out a very special key to the one door that we're not supposed to unlock, and he's giving us a choice between obeying and disobeying. I've been intentionally avoiding using the word abuse thus far, but we have to acknowledge that it's at least one of the pervading themes across all of these games. Control isn't a nebulous thing that we lose or gain by standing on a hilltop and screaming at thunderstorms. Within these games, control is framed as the site of an often imbalanced struggle for power between two competing parties. If I had to name this device or this trope of casting the player as culpable in the actions of the player character, I might call it appositional play or something. Appositional means like something side by side with something else, so the relationship between the two things is a result or consequence of their being parallel to each other. The player and the player character are unified in that their actions have, like, the same consequences, but they're still distinct entities. Our way of being as the player is formulated by the actions or existence of the player character. I'm not going to dwell on the naming, especially because I know there probably is a more appropriate or effective or succinct Latin or Greek root fucking word derivative thing that would describe everything that I'm trying to say. And I know some asshole who speaks Latin, can you speak Latin? Is going to come out and of the car, he's going to come out of a car and he's going to say, you didn't say cribidibinus, which is the more accurate version of what you're talking about. I'm only doing this because I need a sort of shorthand that I can use to refer back to this video in part 2. Honestly, I just have no way of transitioning to the next thing that I want to talk about. Like, I think that this one will be related to the next thing, like, filially at best. Secondly, be nice to the people around you.